Hello and welcome back to A Shark's Perspective. What stories does your business tell? Do your customers remember the story that we think they will tell versus the one they actually heard? And are they aligned despite the fact that many marketing teams are not aligned with the rest of the organization? And then there are all those silos that have been created that confuse the buyer even more. So for today's special guest, I again must say that I'm such a big fan of one of marketing's top influencers, Chris Brogan, the New York Times bestselling author of 9 books and counting, a business storyteller and marketing advisor, a keynote speaker, and the president of Chris Brogan Media. And on this episode, we'll discuss business storytelling, content marketing, unprecedented times, best practices, distracted worlds with 81 open browser tabs, a Viking with a flaming axe riding a shark shooting lasers out of its eyes, and a lot more. So let's tune in to a business storytelling best-selling author with a shark whose stories will be told for centuries to come on this episode of A Shark's Perspective. Chris, thank you again so much for joining us today on A Shark's Perspective. You're obviously an extremely well-known marketer and speaker in the space, but would you mind giving us just a quick synopsis of your background and your career to date?
Oh my golly. Thank you, Kenneth, for having me on.
Of course.
My background is such a patchwork that it looks better in retrospect than it ever did going through. Before I got known for anything I'm known for, I was in telecom and wireless telecom, and I worked with Ma Bell and some of the other phone companies and vendors back in the way old days. And then I, joined the circus somewhere back in 2006. I worked for an event called Video on the Net called Vaughn, and it was basically part of Jeff Pulver's views of the future. And then I left that and went to another event company, and then I started my own. Now, all through this, I started a blog way back in 1998, back when it was called journaling. And I have since then been writing all the various new media technologies as they've come along. I had a podcast starting in 05. I got on YouTube in 05. I'm user 10,212 on Twitter. So all along, it's not that I thought the tools were cool. I thought that, man, there's got to be some really fun ways we could connect with other people. And as I started sharing about that, I started saying to big companies, hey, there's some kind of magic in this old silk hat. And then I have spent my entire professional career wandering in and out of big companies saying dumb things, and some of them help people make money and some don't. And then I wrote some books, and I guess that's kind of how I get here. I wrote my first book with Julian Smith, was a New York Times bestseller by the grace of someone, and 9 books and counting.
It's
and
amazing.
After 2 books, you're like a crazy cat woman, so you know that.
Yeah.
And that's me.
What how often are you writing books now? I mean, is this, once you get through that first one, you start cranking them out pretty quickly?
You do, and then something happens, and you write a mainstream book in 2015 that you think is your best work ever, and the book really could have been subtitled "No Companies Ever Call Chris Ever Again," and because it was a book about entrepreneurship,
Right.
and there's nothing a
Right.
big company wants to hear less about than you could do it by yourself. And so that book was called "The Freaks Shall Inherit the Earth."
Yeah.
There were a whole bunch of bats all over the cover. It's my favorite book I ever wrote. And I wrote it for my kids. So, the fact that Wiley was willing to publish it, even though it's basically just my 2 weirdo kids, because they'll never have a regular desk job ever in their life,
Mm-hmm.
I figured maybe there's a few million other people who won't. So I wrote that. But this next book is called, Who Do I Got to Make Out With Around Here to Get a Speaking Gig? And I think that's basically what it's about. No, but, I'm making jokes, but at the same time, Kenneth, that's how it went. But, I've always had this perspective that I think spans what entrepreneurs and big companies have to do, which is,
Sure.
treat your mom better. That's really my whole business is about how do you make things work better. I'm writing an article while you and I just get ready to do this call about how are we going to do that in a contactless society, and
Yes.
it's just never going to change. I think that's how do you do human interaction better is something I could write about till I'm dead.
Well, of all your books, which is the favorite? Not necessarily the most successful, but just your favorite.
I would have to be The Freak Shall Inherit the Earth. I mean, I think there's lessons in there for people who run big old companies, and I think that it's perfect for, I kind of wrote it with purple-haired people in mind, and
Yeah.
people who start these kind of non-typical businesses. I mean, this fellow that I grew up with, his name was Doug. He was always interesting and highly colorful from childhood. He worked for the New York Philharmonic Orchestra, like you do, and he was a bassoonist. And I guess they get their summers off. Not as many Philharmonic fans in the summer or something. And he wanted to open an ice cream truck in New York City, and he realized that you can rent one of those trucks and you can get their licensed product, but he thought it was all kind of gross and not very good. So he decided to do something pretty bold. We made the big gay ice cream truck. Well, Doug turned the big gay ice cream truck, complete with rainbows and everything, into an ultra successful truck. The line was always around the corner. I finally went and saw
Wow.
him in person, and I had to wait 37 people to meet a kid that I hung out with in 8th grade. Into several restaurants, a big giant cookbook with the Bourdain name all over it, and just massive success. And I wanted to talk to people like that who wanted to start a business, because that's not your typical business starter. And I think there's a lot of room to learn from quirky, interesting people, even if you're, I don't know, Coke.
Absolutely. No, I couldn't agree more. So, out of curiosity, what's your least favorite book?
Oh my!
I mean, is it the first one where you just felt the most clunky, or was that your initial baby, your firstborn?
Well, so listen, it is a very rare thing, and I'll tell you, it was the dumbest thing I ever did. I said to people at Wiley, I said, "Hey, Trust Agents is 10 years old. We should do a 10th anniversary edition." And they're like, "Yeah, sure." And I thought, "Yeah, this is gonna be great." It was not great. Julian and I went looking through that book, and we're like, "Oh man." Some of it was really good,
Yeah,
and some
yeah.
of it was like, "What did we do?" But it was a New York Times bestseller. And I always tell people, I say, much as I'm going to say that I say that to people in the men's room. I'll say that if
Sure.
if I get punched out at a concert or something, I'll be picked up off the floor saying, "You just hit a New York Times bestseller author in the face." As much as it's that, it's best selling, not best writing. It's not best ideas.
Yeah.
So that book's not that great, but it's got some good stuff in it, which is why we fixed it up for a 10th anniversary. But no, my least favorite probably. I did two that were just kind of right time, right place kind of books. One was Social Media 101.
Mm-hmm.
It's a pretty looking book,
Yeah.
but I don't think there's a great deal of value in it. Some people like it. And Google Plus for Business. And the only reason I don't like Google Plus for Business, because if you read it even today without Google Plus, you'd still see my view in it, Kenneth.
Yeah.
The reason I don't like it is, of course, Google Plus failed, and it had nothing to do with it being a bad product.
Absolutely.
It had everything to do with Google saying, "Never mind, we don't need it. Never mind." And so that's me. Bad.
Well, it's so often that I ask people what their favorite book was, but it's rare that I get to ask somebody what their least favorite was when they started. It's always sort of interesting to see how people go through that middle process. And obviously, it sounds a lot better to tell somebody, if you were getting in a fight, that you're a New York Times bestseller than, do you know how important I am? I'm a Kindle bestseller for 99 cents. So there's a lot of those right now. But you brought up a memory of mine, too. I worked in the telecom space as well. It was the single point of contact, or SPOC, for AT&T. So that was a lovely designation that I'll hold. I was one of just a few people from, that represented other consulting firms that were yelled at on many occasions by them. But looking into your background as well, and having heard you speak before, I'd love to kind of dive into some of the things that you talk about, which is really sort of near and dear to me. And one of them, first off, when you talk about losing the thread, I love this topic, and it's that distance between the idea and execution, from the moment a leader first attempts to convey the vision of what they want their team to accomplish, people start to lose the thread. Leaders speak about objectives, point to numbers. They talk about a book they read and repeat other people's words. That's, again, I'm sort of reciting what's on your website, but I understand what you mean by that, but I would love to sort of unpack that whole discussion point.
So one thing I want to say is that when I talk about that thread, the part of that comes from Tamsin Webster's The Red Thread. Comes from the concept of a through line. What happens a lot in this world? Let me give you a good example. There's a little pause between you asking me that question and me answering. What happened was, I thought I had my phone on silent, but I had it on vibrate, so it vibrated, and so I had to look down and mess with it to make sure it was on silent. Right? So look what I did. I got distracted during our call, our very important call here for this podcast, and I had to mess with my phone. Well, that's all humanity. Yeah. Always, way more now, right?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
So think about business and think about leadership and all that. We live in kind of a Netflix world. We live in this world where we're flipping through stuff all the time. If I asked every single person paying attention, well, put this, we're listening to this podcast. What is anyone doing? They're not sitting there with their eyes closed in a dark room. Right. They're, whenever they get to listen to this, they're either out jogging, running, they're, maybe the gym's open, whatever. But we're doing multiple things. If I ask you how many tabs are open on your browser,
Oh
you're going to
God,
make a blush face, right? There's always 81 tabs on someone's browser.
absolutely.
And so that's true at work too. Work's no different. And no matter what kind of role you have, unless you're a neurosurgeon, where you really darn well better be focused, um, we lose the storyline. And what happens is a lot of times with leadership, and the whole reason I came up with this whole story leader idea is, bosses get told all the time, "Hey, listen, you gotta use storytelling because I just read this book and it said storytelling's good." The manager goes, "Oh, okay, boss," and he goes, "You're good at storytelling. You've told some stories. You've drank beer, and that's it." And what happens with stories, and this is something else I learned from Tamsin Webster, by the way, is there's the lesson we think they're going to take from it, and so what we end up having to do is we have to be explicit about what that lesson is.
Hmm.
So when I teach people how to tell business stories, which are different than just any old story, after you end the story, you also have to label the story with kind of what the real takeaway is,
Hmm.
really explicitly. Like, if you took a murder mystery and told it like a business story, it would be so awful.
Oh yeah.
Because the way I tell a murder mystery was the butler did it. Okay, let's talk about it. And then I would tell some
Right.
story. And I'd finish the story and I'd say, and so that's why you should never hire a butler from Panama. And you'd walk away going, "Oh, I totally understand what he said to me there."
Yeah.
It wouldn't be fun. It wouldn't be like a mystery, but you'd get the data you need from it. So that's what I'm teaching in business storytelling is how to front load a story, how to be brief and clear, how to make sure you label and package the story that people understand what to do with it when they're done, and which type of story to use when. That's why I put it together.
So I haven't ever told Tamsin this, but I was mad at her first after the first time I saw her speak because as somebody with ADHD, I can clearly tell you that when you talk about looking at the phone and the 81 tabs, that's me. I mean, it's been
Yep.
been that way my whole life. But when she crystallized something I've been trying to articulate for years and then put it behind that red thread, it just really upset me because she had done it. She articulated it so well, and I love that because I also see it a lot with entrepreneurs today, who try to tell their own story and it just completely gets lost as it goes to. It's the same as with any story. You start on one end with talking about Domino's Pizza, and by the time you get to the end of the line, it becomes Rubber Baby Buggy Bumper or something, absolutely ridiculous example. But it just seems that so often people don't articulate that story well, and it just gets lost as it goes down the line. So then thinking about what you also talk about, how should marketing teams go about developing those marketing strategies that rely more on that business storytelling, customer experience, and digital channel development, especially in light of trying to articulate what their leaders are wanting to convey.
Right. And so there's another break in the system too.
Exactly.
A lot of companies think of marketing as that thing you have to do to get sales, but in no way is it married to what the rest of the organization's doing.
100%.
In fact, there's that sort of sense that there's those weird people in marketing doing that marketing stuff, and we're just going to be over here doing our dumb job, right? And they're so far afield it might as well be from some other planet.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a scenario that I see over and over again in companies because of just how we've been trained to make factory systems and silo systems. It doesn't work, right? Like, we you can watch a really interesting ad for a company and it'll be all wiped out in a bad customer experience in seconds. And so if things aren't aligned, that doesn't really work really well. There's a bank that just recently gave away a whole bunch of really complex business loans. So they said, "We're really here for you in this time of trouble."
Oh yeah.
And then their business loan process was so unnecessarily paperwork heavy and so messy and stupid that it backfired badly. There's other situations where when people are saying, "We're really here to support you," and every single thing they do is, but we don't want to support you by actually executing our business. We'd like to avoid you actually having to take advantage of the business. That becomes a problem. And so the other piece of talking through stories and why so I always say story is the best unit of memory. Like it's the best container for
Mm-hmm.
memory, right? So stories work in a way that nothing else does. If I say, I told you we were discussing your Memphis roots, and I talked about Beale Street, and I talked about Great Barbecue, and I talked about the Peabody Hotel and all that, and you say Memphis, and that's what clicks in my head. And I could walk you through 6 more really fun stories from a
Sure.
few days' time there that happened, by the way, 8 years ago. But if you said to me, Oh, and by the way, FedEx was the anchor sponsor of that event because they wanted to hear me, and they brought like a whole bunch of people. So I was like, oh, well, that's great because I really like the service. And it's those things we're going to remember in times of crisis. What we're going to remember is who did what and in what way. And I think that humans, we live off our memory as best as we can, right? Like we use it to model new stuff. We use it to try to recall stuff that's on the tip of our tongue. When we try to remember what actor was in that movie, we have to kind of scroll through our little mental Netflix to find them. um, this works in a way that's so different than the other levers that people pull in a business. And it's important for productivity, and it's important for delivery, because if you're not working from a story, you're making other systems do the heavy lifting, and it's harder. It's like holding your groceries out in front of you as arm's length instead of letting your entire body structure do it at your sides like normal people.
Sure. Well, we're going through a world, though, with, I hate to say unprecedented times. I just don't want to use that phrase ever again. But, with so much more pressure that's going to be on marketing and businesses to get back to growth, I'm really interested to see where content marketing is going to be part of the play in that. And I'd love to know how you think storytelling will be essential in this mix where we're going to see a lot more pressure needed by businesses just to keep the lights on, employees paid. And it seems like content marketing so often is beat up on a regular basis just from an ROS standpoint, and storytelling such an essential part of that. But do you see marketers changing for the better or worse as we sort of come out of this COVID-19?
So short term, it's going to be worse than anyone could ever imagine, and that's because people are phoning it in. It's there's a difference between authors who are doing something, or creators of any kind who are doing something, from a place in their belly and trying to really help out business. Like always remember that there's like a continuum, right? Like there's some people that are so artistic that their stuff doesn't really serve a business, and there's some people who are so businessy that their stuff doesn't serve anyone's soul, right? It's
Yeah,
just it's
yeah.
just and what we're always aiming for is that kind of needle dial that says this makes me feel something and it makes me want to do something. I'll tell you about a really simple commercial, and I almost never like to praise commercials, because what are they? They're just like the random fodder. But Lincoln Motor Company just announced this thing where you could buy Lincoln on the web. Now, I bought my car in 2010 on the web, because there was a guy who had this cool virtual dealership, and you basically picked out whatever kind of car you wanted. He
Mm-hmm.
sourced it and picked it up for you, and you just added sort of like 1,500 on top, and that was a beautiful thing. And Lincoln says we're going to do this thing where you could just order it on the website. We'll drop it off at your house. We'll just hand you the paperwork and the key, and we'll get out of your driveway. And they wrap that around their catchphrase right now, the power of sanctuary. They said, we know your home is your sanctuary. We know that in this moment it's important to feel safe and secure and okay and blah, blah, blah. We want you to feel that in a Lincoln as well. And in the process, you could just order from the sanctuary of your home, and we'll just drop this thing off in your driveway. And no one's thought like that before, because every car ad is test drives, mileage, and 0% down, right? And so that's good content, even though it's brief and it's a commercial. The stories we're going to need to tell, though, we're going to need to tell many more stories in a contactless world, right? We're going to need more digital, less face to face. And so there's such an opportunity for content. But I think in the short term, people are going to wreck it, Kenneth. I think they're going to just do what they've been doing, which is turn out words for dollars. And I think that if you outsource, and I work for a lot of I write stories for a lot of companies. So I'm not saying don't pay me, but I am saying
Sure.
demand something of quality, demand something that matches what you really want to convey for a story. I think the breakdown again, I hate to keep beating the word story over the head, but you kind of knew I would.
Oh, yeah.
It comes from nobody having a clear vision of what they're trying to get, what they want to convey with their company and what the persona is, so to speak, to use a David Meerman Scott word. It's so important to say, this is what I need the people out there to think about. This is my story of belonging. You belong here because you value this. Is the setting point of how you write good stories for content, for marketing and sales.
So you talk about this even on your website with what you do with launching those kind of projects. How are you doing that in a non-salesy campaign? How do you sort of keep someone interested in telling stories if they're trying to drive sales?
So no one likes to be sold to, but everyone likes to buy, right? I mean, we always want that thing we think that's going to make stuff better.
Mm-hmm.
I had a guy call me yesterday and he wants to do some story leader stuff, and he runs a small moving company. And he said, we're just at this spot where we're just kind of like everybody else. And I'm having real trouble conveying what matters. And it was right there. He just didn't see it. So I explained it to him. I said to him, well, you've got this really kind of cool extra detail about your moving company,
Mm-hmm.
which is that you work with a lot of people who maybe had a rough start in their life. And this is kind of a second chance job for them. Well, you're really not moving stuff. You're moving people. And so we move people needs to be the baseline of your story. And it means that you have to talk about the kind of people who work at this business or the kind of people who really value their opportunity to show you their excellence. And this isn't a job for them. This is a pursuit, And as I walked them through this story, he was like, oh. And I said, so, you can imagine, going to commercial accounts who hire and fire lots of people and move a lot of people around and relocate them. You can imagine saying, we treat every move as if we're moving one of your most valuable assets into place. You'd want to work with us. We're not just there for the hours and the dollars. We're there because we know this is someone else's big chance and they've just come to you. And we want to show them the first part of your experience of landing them in their new place and that kind of thing. And so we got it. And so that's not selling at that point. That's facilitating. And I think the best sales are facilitation. I think the best sales are service. So for instance, when I sell coaching, I never just say, I sell coaching. I say, I know you're in a spot where you're scratching your head and wondering how I'm going to make this work out.
Yeah.
I want to be another set of ears, and I offer that. And the only difference is that, the framing of I offer that means I will take money for that. And that's what we want, right? We want to buy when we need the thing. I gratefully paid money to Tams and Webster to help tighten up my storytelling and my writing about me. And I'm a guy who writes for a living. Mm-hmm. So I think that, you can always sell. I think what's scary is, I'll give you another example from the opposite direction. There's a cruise ship company that has been filling my inbox. And I haven't unsubscribed just because I'm so fascinated.
Yeah.
They want me to get on that cruise ship for $200.
Right.
And I'm like, yeah, I'd love to get on a plague ship, And so, and I'm thinking, there's a story every couple of days about a ship stuck at sea somewhere because no one wants anyone to get off of it. It is not the time to be selling discount offers on the ride. I get why they're doing it because they're doing it from the lazy marketer's playbook. But it is time to talk about what we're going to do going forward and how we're going to build, event experience around a world that needs to be a little bit more hygienically tended to.
Tell you what, everything that's going on with COVID-19, I think is just fascinating to see where there is bad content marketing and everywhere that goes into, whether it's email or whatever it is, and bad salesmanship, stuff that's too heavy direct response that maybe worked in an environment where we sort of ignored it, but now it just seems to highlight everybody's spidey senses to bad marketing. And it's just sad to see people, as you say, sort of dial it in and do it that way. I don't normally bring up particular tweets. It's like everything else where you look at it and it's gone 2 seconds later. But in between when we schedule this and when you just posted something that I really liked, I want to kind of play back and ask you to elaborate on. You said one detail that you've noticed in life and business is that we have no experience with something. We seek only past models to try and fit it into our thinking. This won't work. It's like this other thing that failed, but every innovation is based on a new model not yet built. And so part of that made me think about how marketers continue to still use the past to drive every sort of what they see as innovative marketing going forward. But tell me your thought process through that, if you will, and how that applies to where you're seeing it in business and marketing today.
So there's two words I loathe in my line of business.
Okay.
They're best practices. I think best practices exist in operations world. Disney is a company, the parks. Disney Parks is a company that is the number one in best practices in executing human interaction at an event experience in any way. I'd put any other company behind them is that way. That's their best practices. Suddenly, all their parks get shut down. Suddenly, they're losing $32 million a day. They can't turn to how to keep a trash can empty to answer the future for them. And that's why best practices don't solve future needs. And so when you have to look to innovate, you have to ask more like what is, what if, what next. And I'll give you one of my favorite phrases. So instead of best practices, this is a story from HubSpot, which is also in Boston.
Oh yeah.
HubSpot headquarters, they had been building a new headquarters, and they painted every other wall with that dry erase paint that makes the wall into a dry erase board.
Mm-hmm.
But it was every other wall. So on the wall to the north, you could write on it with a dry erase marker, and a wall to the east, you could not, and so on. And so there was all this writing on all these various walls. And then so somebody one day in a fit of excitement ran up to a wall and wrote, "Why hasn't anyone?" And then everybody screamed, "No, no, 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 no." And it was up there on the wall for a little bit. It just said, "Why hasn't anyone?" And I said, "Please keep that on the wall.
Yeah.
Please keep that. Please, please, please put a frame around it. Please keep it." They overrode me. And in fact, they've changed that method a little bit and it's gone. But I think "why hasn't anyone" is the best start to anything you could ever do in business innovation. Because there's answers. Why hasn't anyone, think about that Seinfeld episode. Why hasn't anyone done make your own pizza restaurants?
Exactly.
Because there'll be a lot of lawsuits. That's why hasn't. But, I think why hasn't anyone really perfected online digital ordering? PizzaHut.com has a really robust digital ordering platform, but it doesn't feel like the way we would order a pizza. Like if we called and we said we wanted this, this, and this, it really wouldn't feel as mechanical as Pizza Hut's. So, I think that while we need so much more technology to execute better on some of these things like contactless experiences, well, telemedicine, why hasn't anyone just sent you all the stupid stuff? You could pee in a cup in any building in the world. There's some that is a little illegal to do, but why do we always have to drive to a doctor's office, wait 75 minutes in a waiting room full of really sick people to pee in a cup? The answer is obviously you don't. So now medicine is going to change. All these things are going to change because they have to. And I think it's great. Well, why hasn't anyone done X is going to be one of the ways, Kenneth, that we find our way forward and swim the right places.
Great point. And, side note, I know David Meerman Scott and the CEO of HubSpot have been to like 75 different Grateful Dead conferences.
Yes.
It's a crazy number that he's told me about. But, one of the best topics or best points I think that I saw on your website, and I'd love to ask you this question and help you explain to business leaders out there. In a world where people can buy from anyone, why should they buy from you?
So I put that question up there, and let's be really honest. In most B2C companies, that answer is, in a world where people could buy from Amazon, why should they buy from you? You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
In a B2C world, that's the competitor a lot of times is somebody like Amazon. And it's been really hard to answer that question for years. And now, because of this COVID-19 thing, maybe there's an answer to that. Maybe it's because local service still matters. Maybe it's because you want to keep your dollars in the neighborhood where the people will stay employed and that sort of a thing. But, a lot of what also happens in these moments is there are businesses that don't really need to or deserve to continue. So I like to answer that question on B2B and B2C scale because I think that, I think it's a better version of start with why, right? Because why should they buy from you is a much more articulated and useful question. And if the answer is price, it's probably not the right answer. If the answer is quality, then you better keep that quality up. It's a fun question to work from. And sometimes the answer can be something fun and quirky. We just talked about David Meerman Scott and Brian Halligan being into the Grateful Dead. There's one reason that some people hire Meerman, as I like to call him, David Meerman Scott, because he's a guy who loves the dead. Another group of people loves him because he's an Apollo astronaut junkie.
Right.
And he knows all kinds of cool stuff about that.
Yeah.
There's all these quirky things that make us us. And I think that with me, you're going to get a weirdo. Like when people hire me to come speak at an event, I'm going to talk about superheroes. I'm going to talk about bodily functions. Like it's guaranteed. I'm not necessarily going to cuss like some folk, but I am definitely not going to stick to, you know, nobody ever got fired for buying IBM. I'm the one you get fired for buying.
Yeah.
And so I think that's my answer to that question.
Yeah. Well, it's great. So I live under that premise as well because I know if I can find a really good niche of people who like sharks, MMA, and superheroes, and there's a
Right.
marketing business leadership function, I'm their guy. That once that phone really starts ringing, I'll be able to justify that. But you're somebody who's well known as an author. You've got a diverse background. You've done a lot of things, but obviously you're a sought after speaker as well. With COVID-19, have you started to really rethink your own speaking career as well, and where you may or may not pivot in the longer term? I don't mean just the shorter term because you've got things to fill in, but are you looking at speaking differently as part of your own personal mix?
That is a really good question. A little backstory for that. So I had a really meteor rise in the early days, like 2007, 2008, 2009. My number just kept going up. Then Trust Agents hit and won that big old New York Times thing,
Mm-hmm.
and it went even higher. And 2010, I was flying high. I spoke 106 events in
Wow.
2010, which averages out to about one every 3 days. And living life. Shortly afterwards, I got separated and then finally divorced. My family fell apart, and I just hadn't spent a whole lot of time with my kids, which is one factor in that. And I went, maybe I need to dial this back a little bit. Which is a really personal story, but it's true. And so I said, well, I'll cut it down. So I went from 106 one year to 40 something the next year, which to me was cutting it down, which is still like almost one a week,
Yeah.
and went a little less. And then it's been a lot quieter the last 2 or 3 years because I don't have some new book out there right now. So no one's kind of matching me to a particular idea. And I wasn't really nurturing the business. I was just saying yes if the engagement worked. So this year, 2020, was when I started saying, I should get out there a little bit more. And I was like, okay. And so I started asking around. I started looking around, just like you said when you got back into it. I'm asking my friends who run events, and one of them was like, yeah, sure, fine. And then COVID-19 hits, and I
Mm-hmm.
said, oh, well, so I messaged a friend who's running an event who had a few people cancel. And I was like, well, I'll go down, whatever. I'm not going to catch a virus. And then the world shut down. And I said, well, there's that. And so I had not been speaking. Speaking was not a high percentage of my world. I'd been doing a lot of consulting work
Mm-hmm.
instead, which is like professional speaking, just in smaller rooms, fewer applause. And I definitely will continue to do that. I'm working on a new book, so if the world reopens, I would love to speak on that book because I love the stage. But I think that one of the details I'm going to try to bring forward in the next few years is just how to be you at a distance, how to be you in the digital, because I think that there's a lot of folks who aren't us who don't know how to look into a camera and who don't know how to keep their mouth near the microphone and who didn't have any kind of media experience before. And
Mm-hmm.
so I think that there's a real opportunity for everyone to suddenly have to be media stars of some kind internally, uh, to want to learn a little bit about how to do that a little better and how to deliver some value and how to make content that speaks in this space. So I feel like I'll have some work in front of me. It's just kind of slow going as everyone still tries to get their feet back underneath them.
Well, everybody thinks they're getting their training on TikTok, so I guess that's where so many of them are getting their media training right now. But I remember talking to Seth Godin about this one time, and it was really about how I'm a little bit of a germaphobe and have been my entire life with some OCD issues. But he also was talking about as things were starting to approach with all this stuff going on. He's trying to dial back some of his own speaking. But I never thought that my own, germophobia would play into my long term speaking career. But it's really interesting, and I'm glad you said that about family because there's a lot of folks that learn that lesson. I've tried to balance my own speaking with being able to balance family first, and maybe I'm just lucky that I got back into it later after losing parents, so I wasn't on the road as much as you. But it's a tough lesson for a lot of folks out there.
It sure is.
Chris, you have this amazing, awesome cartoon character on your website of you riding a shark shooting lasers out of its eyes. It's literally upsetting to me that I don't have that, considering I have a great white and other shark stuff on there. How did that come about?
My friend Josh Fisher has worked with me and for me in different capacities since 2009. And Josh has worked with, for instance, Baxter Brewing up in Maine. He's done all their art for several years. So he does
Yeah.
beer can art for all kinds of cool companies. He has worked with some very interesting clients on his art. And since Josh and I ever started to work together as far back as '09, it was magic like you never can imagine. And if you ever, anyone listening, if you've ever tried to work with art people and had a real struggle trying to convey your idea, imagine these kinds of things. I'd say, Josh, do like an old timey medicine bottle, kind of like those ones that like would have like snake oil in them or something like that.
Yeah.
Do that and make me a cool label like that too, and blah. And he would know exactly what I meant and send exactly what I wanted. I'd say, Josh, draw me like as a lumberjack swinging an axe. And he perfectly, just flawlessly. Josh, I need a superhero kind of a thing, sort of retro 60s comic looking, because we're going to talk about finding your superpower of flight. Got it. Never like, what do you think it should look like? What color should the guy be? 100% every time I would say, this is great. Or if there was ever a change, it was 100% the font. Like, oh, can
Yeah.
you make a fatter font, I guess?
Right.
Okay. And I wouldn't, there's 10 million fonts,
Right.
and he would just find it. So I was really frustrated one day, Kenneth, and you know how it goes. All your ideas aren't really quite working. All your analogies aren't working. It's like when you go to pick out a password and they hate all of your password choices, or a username, and they're like, you can't have that one either. So you write something,
Right.
I had a friend, Jonathan, who he launched his entire social media presence on the concept the name I wanted was taken. And that was his
That's
his
great.
username.
Yeah.
So I said to Josh, out of a fit of rage, I said, Josh, can you draw me as a space Viking riding a laser shark with rainbows shooting out of it? And he goes, gotcha. Like an hour later, what do you think? Like this? And it's a sketch and it looks perfect. I
Oh
go,
my gosh. Yeah.
finish the sketch. That was it. Me and a shark, like a Viking with a flaming axe,
A
laser shark.
microphone in the other hand.
Yep.
A
And so I
skull
send
on
that,
top
Kenneth.
of the axe.
I have sent that to everyone on my business proposals and things like that. The United States government has that logo in front of them on some proposals that I'm trying to make money off with the United States Navy.
That's fantastic.
And they're looking at my laser shark going, who in the world?
I love it. I love it. It's fantastic. So I asked this of everybody that's been on my show, A Shark's Perspective, since my nickname is Shark. What is your favorite kind of shark and why?
I have died since the beginning of this conversation to talk about sharks. I have not ever swam with them, but so let me start my story. So when Jaws came out in 1976 or whatever it was, I begged my parents to take me. My parents both said, this is a stupid idea. You're a kid. I was like 6 years old. I was like, please, 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 7 years old, something. Let me see this movie about sharks. Yeah, no. Please, please, please. So we go to see it. My parents were projectionists at movie theaters
Oh,
at
wow.
the time, which is the people who run it.
Oh, yeah.
We went to the drive-through and watched Jaws on a drive-through screen. So, movie screen times 30. I was scared to death.
Oh, yeah.
Now, born and raised in Maine.
Oh, wow.
And Jaws has sort of been
Right.
around New York. And so I've been scared of great whites and sharks in general forever. Then the 80s come. Roger Moore has a scene where there's a shark introduced into a swimming pool. And I thought, I'm not even safe in a swimming pool. Sharks can get me there. I go to the aquarium in Atlanta, the one that the Home Depot guy funded.
I love it. Yep.
Beautiful, right? All those whale sharks. I hear all the great stories about them. And they invite me. Would you like to swim in this tank? Now, of course, you're thinking, oh my gosh, I would love to get in that tank. I'm thinking, no, I don't think so. And so they say, so sharks are my animal I'm most afraid of and most passionate about. That's what we have in common, except you're less afraid of them. I say, I don't think so. So I'm telling her, she goes, no, it's no problem. We feed them all the time. Like, they're not going to bite you. We get on the bottom. I said, they must eat the occasional exotic fish out of your aquarium. She goes, well, snacks happen. And I said, see? And so I have a lifelong fear and passion for sharks. When you said I like to scuba in Tampa, I thought in my head instantly, I went, okay, so bull sharks, sometimes a tiger. And that's the first thought I had, because I know where they are, Kenneth. I don't want to run into them on my own.
Somebody asked me this about Jaws the other day. Jaws is one of the most amazing movies on the planet ever in history. It is the
Yes.
opposite of the way sharks are in real life.
Yes.
But it is such good filmmaking, even with how bad the technology was, that you could do a lot better with CGI today. But then, just from a storytelling standpoint, then you end up with 47 meters down the second one that was,
Right.
looks like a shark, but it's just horrible storytelling. I still wouldn't see it, but and I think it was Thunderball. But
You're right.
I think that was the James Bond one. I've seen every James Bond movie like 100 times, so that's the one that comes to memory. But the Atlanta Aquarium is fantastic. They've got 3 whale sharks. They've got some small ones. They've got a lot of the nurse sharks, obviously on the bottom, but they're about to expand in, I want to say 2021, with a huge shark exhibition, which I just went to it last fall, and I can't wait till they open that back up. But bull sharks are really of note, the ones you really have to watch out for because they are the most aggressive fish out there. But I'm not afraid of them. I've been swimming with them for years. And once you figure out they're fish and not attack dogs on the loose, then it becomes a lot easier. You just have to really, really respect their territory. I mean, it's the numbers of times that I've seen them in the wild, I can't even tell you how many times I've seen them in the wild. And I remember seeing several sand tiger sharks as well in the Clearwater area. But they're absolutely beautiful creatures, and I've become such an advocate since I was a child. So I appreciate you letting me indulge. You just happen to have a great caricature art on there that I absolutely love, and that makes everybody to go to chrisbrogan.com to see it. Well, Chris, it's a special time in my show. Are you ready for the 5 most interesting and important questions that you're going to be asked today?
I have been thinking about nothing since.
All right,
I'm ready.
Perfect. I was going to ask you on number 1, but I'm going to switch. I'm not going to ask you Tamsin or Tom Webster because that's just too political. They're both great people. But I know you love the red thread. But number 1, since you talked about pizza earlier, I'm going to ask you this question: deep dish or thin crust?
Oh my gosh, this is religion. We're starting with religion here. Yeah. I like a thin crust.
I agree there as well. Number 2 people you talk about that I both idolize. One of them I just think is one of the greatest speakers in the world: Richard Branson or Tony Robbins?
This sounds so ultra name droppy because I met Richard via Skype and I hung out with Tony for a video series. I'm going to go with Branson. I just think sort of the world spanning stuff he's doing puts him a notch above.
Yeah, and it does help. I mean, but they're both amazing. Tony, I just think, is one of the most amazing speakers I've ever seen in my life.
Truly.
It's just crazy. And again, David Meerman Scott told me that one of his most important things that ever happened to him in his career was being able to open for Tony Robbins. I mean, that's just crazy to think. David's a well-known speaker, and his highlight of his career is opening for Tony Robbins. So,
but it's a big event, and Tony's energy and what he drives to those events is amazing. I've not been to one of those. When I met him, it was it makes the story sound even more smarmy or something. But I flew to his house because he was filming this thing called the Internet Money Masters.
Yeah,
and we had a date to record it, and something went wrong on his side or something, and it messed up. So this makeup date was me flying to hang out with him. And he mentioned something about going to one of his events, and I said, "Yeah," in that sort of way that you say when you know they don't really. And David, subsequently has made me regret it every day of my life. So.
I bet. Well, by the way, I'm going to be launching a mastermind at some point soon to help people get over their fear, business leaders especially. So my version of Tony Robbins' Walk on Coals, which is another reason why I like the guy, is swimming with sharks. So, the coals don't possibly eat you, but you can sit at the end of the boat and watch from the top deck if you like. So, all right, number 3, gummy bears or jelly beans?
Wow, that's a good question. Jelly beans, but I'm going to make it worse. I love black jelly beans.
Oh, absolutely. Licorice, the best.
Yes, sir.
All right, number 4, a storyteller / consultant or author?
A sounds so pretentious, so I guess I'd go with author.
Yeah. Well, did you mention that you're a New York Times bestseller?
I did. Not yet.
Not yet.
On my business card for a really long time, many, many years, my title was listed as typist.
Oh, that's great.
It's just because I can't abide I don't know where this came from, but I really just can't abide, having to live and die on my title. I used to, I guess. Maybe it's like, an ex-smoker is worse than a
Right,
non-smoker.
right.
I'm sort of an ex-title fetishist, so I now go for the simplest title I could come up with.
Well, I'm an ex-smoker, but another story is I've got some cards that have Chief Shark Officer on there, and I love getting emails from people that don't appreciate that that's a completely ridiculous title, and they say congratulations on the Chief Shark Officer title. I love every time I've gotten that. But number 5, and the most important question that you're going to be asked today is biscuits or cornbread.
Cornbread. And I know, like, I'm insulting a whole massive amount of human beings when I say that. And I had some incredible biscuits in a little small airport restaurant in Norman, Oklahoma, with my friend Becky McCrae. And maybe it was the company that made the biscuits so good, but those are the best biscuits I ever put in my mouth. Don't tell my mom, because she makes biscuits. But I love cornbread, and I don't know why. Born and raised in New England. I think that's probably something to do with it.
Sure.
But if you put the gun to my head, you can only have the one. It's going to be cornbread. Sorry.
Nice. So, Chris, where can people find out more about you with getting the books, keep up with hearing you speak, and more?
chrisbrogan.com. And if you don't mind, just grab my newsletter, because my newsletter has one extra magic superpower, which is you can always just hit reply any day of the week. Yeah. And you can talk to me. I don't have any staff that answers it. You just talk to me direct. So not only do you get content, but you get contact.
Absolutely. Chris, thank you again so much for being with us today on A Shark's Perspective.
Best day of my week, Kenneth. Thanks for having me.
So there was my conversation with Chris Brogan, the New York Times bestselling author of 9 books and counting, a business storyteller and marketing advisor, a keynote speaker, and the president of Chris Brogan Media. Let's take a look at 3 key takeaways from our conversation with him. First, we live in a very noisy and distracted world, flipping through stuff all the time. Like he said, you're probably not sitting there while your eyes are closed listening to this podcast. You're walking around, looking at your phone, checking emails, etc. You've heard me say 1,000 times on the show that the confused buyer always says no. And here's another reason why that alignment is so important. Chris talks about that common thread, that through line that's crucially important to businesses, especially where they lose the storyline. And then there's the lesson from the story that we think they will tell versus the one they actually heard. He also breaks up the great point with them remembering your story, that you have to explicitly label the story with what the real takeaway is. We've created so many silos, internally and externally, and these stories get told by marketers who don't know what the rest of the organization is actually doing. If things aren't aligned, then it won't work nearly as well. So align the story with your organization. Second, you've heard me mention a lot lately where I worry some about content marketing in the near future. He reminded us that there is a big opportunity here, but he's concerned as well that marketers will just be turning out words for dollars, so to speak. He calls it the lazy marketer's playbook. So we need to keep reaching for that better ground in the middle of the artsy content that we can't use and the stuff that's too direct response that we shouldn't be using. The content that makes us feel something and makes us want to do something. That's what we need. He said, and I quote, demand something of quality. Demand something that really matches what you want to convey for a story. Third, he loathes the phrase best practices, and God bless him for saying that. He thinks of best practices as operations. I'm okay with it in marketing, but what typically happens, especially in marketing, is that it becomes groupthink, and that doesn't help anybody. What he does importantly remind us of, though, is that best practices don't solve future needs. So when you start trying to be an innovative business leader, don't solely leverage the past to drive your innovation. As he said, why hasn't anyone? It's the best start to anything you can do in business innovation. That's a better place to start. Got a question? Send me an email to kenneth@asharksperspective.com. Thank you again for the privilege of your time. As Chris said, treat your mom better. That's just another reminder for me to give a shout out to my mom, who's hopefully just looking down on our baby shark and smiling. So join us on the next episode of A Shark's Perspective.